The Stonemason. Simon and Mark were students renting a tenement flat in Leith. Their landlord was relaxed, verging on negligent, and was happy for them to alter the flat to suit their needs. This suited both students, as the flat was in a state of disrepair, with broken plumbing, peeling wallpaper, and in Mark's bedroom a mess of transparent plastic sheeting had been stapled to one of the walls. The boys decided to use this as an opportunity to learn DIY skills. One of the first things they did was pull off all the plastic sheeting from Mark's wall, expecting to find evidence of damp or mould underneath. To their surprise, there was nothing. In fact, the wall was in the best condition of all the walls in the flat, untouched except for some light cracks in the plaster made by the staples. This was unexpected, as the rest of the walls were riddled with holes, nails, screws, and splayed masonry plugs. Mark decided to put up some shelves in his bedroom and chose the untouched wall to mount them. He and Simon went out shopping for the tools: shelving brackets, plywood, screws, and a drill. Mark was full of excitement for the project when they returned to the flat, and in the late afternoon he began marking, measuring, and sawing the wood. Mark started drilling the next morning. It did not go well. The plaster was exceptionally fragile, and the masonry behind it was incredibly hard. Mark blunted 2 drill bits before he made a hole deep enough to fix a masonry plug into. As he hammered the plug in, the fragile plaster crumbled away, and the hole got bigger and bigger, too big for the plug, so that when the shelf was screwed in, it wobbled and collapsed under any weight. Frustrated and with rising anxiety, Mark tried repeatedly to insert a plug, but the problems compounded. After an hour or so, and surprised by the continuing noise, Simon intervened. The wall now looked like any other in the flat, riddled with holes, screws, and loosely mounted shelf brackets. Simon advised Mark to take a break and reconsider the project with a clear head. They laughed about the situation over a cup of tea, and Mark calmed down. Afterwards, they returned to the wall and plastered over the holes as best they could, deciding to put the project on hiatus until they got professional advice. That night, Mark awakened Simon at 3 a.m. He was deeply agitated and explained that as he was going to sleep, it occurred to him that he did not know what was on the other side of the wall. He was terribly angry with himself for being so blasé about the project. There could be gas pipes, electricity cables, or water conduits. Simon tried to reassure Mark that the wall was a sensible place to drill. Mark had chosen it because there were no indications of gas or water supply in the room, and if Mark had hit something, they would know by now, so it was surely fine. Mark was partly mollified by this, but kept repeating, "What about the other side?" The other side of the wall belonged to a flat in the neighbouring building. Simon had noticed it when they moved in. It was peculiar as the windows were covered in silver foil. "That flat is full of students, too lazy to put up blinds," Simon comforted Mark. "They wouldn't care if you made a hole in the wall. Besides, the bricks are so hard that you would need a much more powerful drill to go right through. There is nothing to worry about." With that, Simon bid Mark good night, and somewhat more self-consciously, now his acute agitation had passed, Mark excused himself and went back to bed. In the morning, Simon found Mark setting mousetraps. "We have mice or rats," Mark said. He had slept fitfully, disturbed by a scurrying sound within the walls. "I need to redo the plaster today too." Mark had awoken to find yesterday's plaster had crumbled away, re-exposing the holes. Over the next few days, Mark continually reapplied plaster, experimenting with different brands and quantities. Each morning, however, Mark awoke to find the plaster had crumbled again and re-exposed the holes he had drilled. The rodent problem had not been solved either. The scraping sounds in the wall grew louder each night. Mark became obsessed with plugging up holes he had made. In his mind, both problems were linked. Somehow, the mice, the scurrying, had been caused by his careless drilling. He felt sure if he could fix the first problem, the other would stop, although he could not explain why to Simon. Unsuccessful with plaster, Mark decided to fill the holes with wooden dowels. Simon agreed to help, and they dipped the wood in glue before lightly hammering it into the wall. Not long after they had finished, Mark sighed, notably relieved. Suddenly there came a thunderous banging on the other side of the wall. It was so violent that it caused some of the intact plaster to crumble, and a precariously stacked pile of textbooks on Mark's desk collapsed. Simon was taken aback by this cacophony, while Mark's face turned ashen, devastated with shock. Simon tried to lighten the mood with a witty explanation, but the banging started again. It continued at sporadic intervals of up to an hour for the rest of the day. Simon recommended that Mark move his desk into the living room and stay out of his room until the issue was resolved. Traumatized, Mark complied, shaking his head in disbelief and despairing about the situation. Simon was surprised by Mark's extreme reaction, but put it down to the difficult few nights he had had and the stress of the flat renovations. Reluctantly, Simon decided to visit the neighbours in the early evening to apologise and ask them to stop the banging. Simon, unsure of the right flat number, but finding the neighbouring building door left ajar, entered nervously. He climbed to the second floor and walked up to the door of the flat adjacent to their own. There was no doorbell, and the letterbox had been nailed shut. Light could be seen under the door, so Simon knocked. There was a scurrying sound inside the flat. No response. Simon knocked again, louder this time, but there was just silence. Increasingly frustrated at being ignored, Simon knocked furiously and called loudly, "I know there is someone home. Please stop banging on our walls. Please answer so we can talk about this." The scurrying sound came again, but no answer. Just as Simon turned to leave, disgusted by their rudeness, a crumpled piece of paper was pushed underneath the door. Opening it, a large powder of masonry dust emptied onto the floor. There was nothing written on the paper. Around the same time, an angry middle-aged man came out of the flat opposite across the hall. "You've just woken our baby up. What's your problem?" Simon explained, but the man just shook his head. "Can't you see that flat is empty? It's for sale, so you're confused. Now stop the noise or I'll call the police." The man slammed his door, and Simon looked up to what he had been gesticulating at. Sure enough, an estate agent's plaque had been nailed above the door. When Simon returned to the flat, Mark was in better spirits as the knocking had stopped. Simon did not tell Mark about the strange paper full of dust, and tried not to place too much importance on it himself. The night passed without incident, and over breakfast the boys discussed optimistically that their strange tiff with the flat next door might be over. Mark was pleased to report that he did not hear any more scurrying and seemed convinced it was due to filling the holes. The students both had a full day of lectures in the city centre and returned together afterwards in the early evening. They were alarmed to find that their flat door was open when they arrived. Inside Mark's room was a small, haggard-looking tradesman, who they found measuring the wall and making notes. He greeted them curtly. "Your landlord called me after downstairs complained about brick dust falling from their ceiling. I'm not sure how you've made such a mess, but we're going to have to reface the masonry and replaster the wall, which will cost you." The holes in the wall he was measuring had grown to the size of dinner plates. The dowels they fitted were now strewn across the floor. Mark was aghast. "We didn't do this. We have no idea how this happened." The tradesman seemed unconvinced. "You'll have to talk about this with your landlord. Anyway, I'll be back in a couple of days to start the work." With that, he left, and the boys were left gaping in disbelief at the ruined wall. "We shouldn't stay here tonight," said Mark, and started to pack a rucksack with clothes. Simon was defiant. "No, if this is the neighbour messing with us, I want to be here to film it happening. I can use the film to prove we did nothing wrong." Looking at the mess around him and remembering yesterday's unpleasant confrontation with the neighbour, Simon started pounding on the wall in anger. The room shook and more plaster crumbled to the floor. Simon continued anyway, his anger rising. He hit the wall harder and harder. Mark had to physically pull him away, fearful of what extra damage he was causing. They sat for a while in silence. Mark was texting friends in the city to ask for a place to stay. Simon was shaking his head and staring up at the wall. Suddenly, Simon got up and stared up close into one of the holes. The hole was about 3 inches deep. Shutting one eye, he moved his head inside the wall and focused on a small point of light inside the defaced masonry. There was a hole all the way through into the neighbour's flat. Simon could not see much, but the room across seemed to be lit with an intense fluorescent light. There was a moving shadow, and for a split second, Simon registered the form of a large dog or some other kind of animal on all fours. Just as Simon turned to ask Mark to come and look, Mark shrieked in horror, "Watch out!" Mark pulled Simon back further away from the wall. A sharp metal instrument was stabbed through the hole, protruding a few inches into the room. It caught Simon's cheek and drew blood. "We need to get out of here now," said Mark, but as they tried to open their front door to leave, it would not fully open. Something vice-like had been wedged beneath it, preventing it from moving more than a centimetre on its hinges. As Mark frantically jostled the door back and forth, Simon found an envelope posted through the letterbox, full of masonry dust. Simon told Mark they needed to try a different way, and suggested Mark's window. The flat was on the second floor, but when they had moved in, Simon had noted that you could dead hang from the stone ledge of Mark's window and drop onto the grass garden below with minor injury. The other rooms were out of question, as the windows opened onto the street side and a hard pavement below. Rushing back into Mark's room, Simon wrestled with the window, while Mark looked on in horror at the implement stabbing further and further into the room. On closer inspection, the implement was not metal, but something organic. In awful realization, Mark saw that it was a cracked and sharpened fingernail protruding from a grotesquely long finger. Mark screamed at Simon to hurry, but the window handle was stiff and of the German design that required a 180-degree turn to fully open. Simon cursed as the window partially opened vertically for the third or fourth time. As Simon struggled on, 4 more fingers appeared from adjacent holes, and then 5 more fingers appeared from a set of holes a metre or so to the left, all stabbing erratically. Mark caught sight of the fingers underneath the nails. The bone was exposed, fractured and serrated above a bloody joint. The intent of the stabbing became clear. The fingers were sawing the wall away, at angles that when their lines crossed, the wall would fall apart, and whatever was on the other side would get in. Mark moved Simon out of the way and hammered the window handle down so violently that the springs gave way and the window collapsed open on one hinge. Mark jumped without dead hanging and without preparing for the fall. His leg broke as he landed. Simon turned to lower himself in a pull-up position off the window shelf. In doing so, he caught sight of what was emerging from the wall. His grasp faltered and he fell onto his back, cracking 3 ribs and bruising his thorax. Some neighbours saw the fall and called an ambulance. One neighbour went outside to attend to the agonised casualties on the floor, who were crawling away from the building and looking up in horror at the window. The casualties would not be comforted and pleaded with the neighbour to take them away. They were obsessed that something might come through the window after them. The emergency services arrived. As they were being stretchered away, the boys pleaded with an attending police officer to be cautious because there was a dangerous animal inside their flat. In the preceding police report, it was noted that there was no obstruction in front of the flat door, and once it was kicked down, no dangerous animal inside. It was, however, reported that there was a large amount of dust and rubble in the bedroom that the casualties fell from, and that an opening had been made to a flat in the neighbouring building. On inspection, the neighbouring flat was almost empty, although the lights had been left on. It smelled foul, as if an animal had been left there unsupervised and had urinated on the floor. The only furnishings were the lights and some festering woolen mats and blankets. Inside one of the blankets there was a broken drill, which looked like it had been chewed up inside some machinery. The boys were discharged from the hospital after a few days, and on the recommendation of the university and their doctors, went back to their family homes to recuperate. They were visited there by a psychiatrist and a drug support specialist. The specialists found it interesting that the boys' stories basically corroborated one another. But they were clear in their notes that the narrative originated from some drug-induced psychosis. No drugs were found in their flat, and the boys had no history of drug taking. However, synthetic THC, which is growing in popularity among young people, had been known to produce similar psychotic symptoms, and it is possible the boys were spiked. In time, the boys recovered, and as part of their therapy, it was suggested that they return to the flat to collect their belongings in person, accompanied by their families and a therapist. The damage to the wall had been repaired in the meantime, and when they arrived, the flat looked better than they had ever seen it. There were still markings on most of the walls, but a fresh coat of paint had gone a long way in improving the overall feel of the place. The repaired wall in Mark's room looked particularly good, and in fact, underneath the transparent plastic sheeting protecting the new layer of plaster, it was practically unblemished. The Stonemason was written, performed and recorded by Ezra Briggs and licensed under a Creative Commons non-commercial international share-alike license. For more information, please visit ezrabriggs.co.uk.